Howdy, howdy, howdy. My name's Anashi Sasuke. Welcome back to Reading 001. We're still in Ouroboros because when I got to the final section of Ouroboros, it turned out to be a whole lot more stuff. And I wasn't really sure what to do about it, which is part of the reason why it's been almost 2 weeks since I last did anything. The other reason was I was not at my computer as often as I should be. But, in the interest of trying to see how to go about handling these, I'm going to read the things for the first Overseer, and depending on how long that takes, I might also do the ones for the second Overseer. And depending on how long that takes, I might do the third one. So basically, if I do the first two and the video's hitting in let me rephrase that. When the video hits an hour, I'm going to stop. So, if I finish the first two and it's not an hour, I'll do the next one. And if I finish that one and it's not an hour, I'll peek at the next one. So, 0513, the other Overseer, formerly Dr. Felix Carter, Caucasian male, date of birth unknown, was once a doctor for a research consortium named the International Academy of Existential Sciences. Early conspirator of 051 and the individual called the Administrator. Supposedly was a bargaining chip used in a deal made with death itself to allow death to sit on the council while it grossly prolonged the lives of the Overseers. Presumed extremely dangerous, location is only speculated and considered impossible to reach. So first off is the access log. Chapter 1 at the Precipice. Earlier, the proceedings came to order in the back room of an abandoned Somali warehouse. Calvin sat at the head of a long plastic folding table, quietly picking at a fingernail. At the other end of the table were huddled the 7 members of Delta Command, the High Council of the Chaos Insurgency. Calvin had almost rolled his eyes when he'd been ushered into the room. For all their soaring rhetoric, they were still unable to come up with anything more substantial than dusty old buildings and cheap plastic furniture to conduct their business in. I also want to point out the fact that it feels like the reason this is called Ouroboros to me is what's happening is that it's going to reveal that last bit of talking about how Calvin turned into the thing and started picking people off was a Hello Zep moment of Calvin joining the organization by way of the Chaos Insurgency, not because he lost his daughter, but because it was a plan from the start to cross off the foundation for all the stuff they did in the previous portions of Ouroboros before leading up to part 4. Which is why it's called Ouroboros, because everything's a loop. Anyway, Delta Command, he knew, had been formed by the engineer to bring together the 7 squabbling branches of what once had been called the Insurgency. Each of the 7 groups sent a representative to Delta, and together they formed the larger resistance. The name was a joke, of course. According to legend, the engineer had nearly given up trying to coordinate the bickering factions by saying never in history has a more chaotic insurgency been mishandled into existence. The name stuck, though Delta thought that chaotic insurgency wasn't nearly distinguished enough, thus the Chaos Insurgency. None of these people liked each other, nor did they care for Calvin. He'd had a distinguished career as a CI agent, first supporting and later leading larger attacks on the Foundation. He, like all those within the insurgency, knew their place in the world. The purpose of the insurgency hadn't ever been to destroy the Foundation, just act as a check against it. A constant thorn in their side, never allowing the Foundation to become too complacent. If they were focused on the insurgency, the logic followed, they wouldn't be able to do as much damage elsewhere. Thus far, the strategy hadn't panned out. But Calvin was exceptionally good at his job, and was less a thorn and more a hacksaw in the gut of the Foundation. His contributions to the insurgency's goals had brought him swiftly through their ranks, and at one point in the recent past, he had been considered as the next member from his faction to join Delta. Shortly beforehand, however, he was accused of mishandling insurgency resources, limited though they were, in a raid on a Foundation site holding several potentially magical texts. Although the investigation against his actions hadn't amounted to anything of note, the incident came at the absolute wrong time and he was passed over for ascension to Delta in place of a mid-level bureaucrat who had previously been a junior congressman for the state of New Jersey, Howard Kowalski. Coincidentally, it was Howard Kowalski who spoke first. "Good afternoon, Calvin," the portly man said, balancing a pair of thin glasses on the end of his pointed snout. "We appreciate you, making the trip out here. As you know, we're in the middle of renovations to Delta Command headquarters." This was, of course, a joke. Delta maintained that their former command center, or commander center, the one built by the engineer himself, was being renovated, necessitating the empty warehouses and dingy back alley gatherings of the group. It was a public secret that the building had been leveled by the Global Occult Coalition nearly 3 decades prior, though Delta refused to acknowledge this. So this will have to do, I think, yes. He nodded and tapped a stack of papers against the desk. I guess what we're most curious about here, Calvin, is this, this document we hear you've recovered. He leaned forward, the glare from a lamp catching his glasses as he peered over the stack of papers. The journal. Do you have it? Calvin nodded. If you allow me a moment of your time, I promise we'll talk about the journal. One of the other members of Delta, a tall, long-haired woman named Norris, made a sound in the back of her throat. Don't test our patience, boy! It's bad enough that we've had to suffer the journey out here, but I swear to God, if we did it so you could bullshit around with some fake book, I'll have your job. Kowalski laughed nervously as Calvin raised an eyebrow at the outburst. Now, Priscilla, Kowalski said cautiously. Let's just hear what he has to say. Calvin has really done a lot for our organization. I think we can all agree. Grudging nods were had all around. And I think he deserves the benefit of the doubt here. He motioned Calvin to go on. Calvin picked up his own sheaf of papers and opened it up. Alright, so what you're seeing in front of you is something I've been working on with a few people over the last few months. Call it a statement of purpose. We've been working in conjunction with Dr. Vernon Alderman's lab in Sydney, and the results of his team's work has been troubling. The Foundation's continued testing of unnatural entities and phenomena has exacerbated the problem caused by those same entities. They're itching at a wound. Couple that with the knowledge we gained from Lieutenant Horver's team regarding Scranton anchor calibration shifts in the last few years, and the evidence is clear. He paused to flip to the next page. We're quickly reaching a point of no return. He scanned down further on the page. Now, our current models estimate that we might not make it out of the 2020s without a major public supernatural event, and then not even another 5 years past that before we start seeing things too big for even the Foundation to deal with. That's not good, and it is the reason why we need to address this now. If we wait any longer, we might not be able to do anything of value. Sylvester Sloan, the oldest member of Delta, hacked out a queer cackle. Our value comes in inhibiting the Foundation's efforts. What it sounds like you're about to say is that you intend to interrupt them entirely. Calvin leaned back slightly. More than that, I intend to uproot the Foundation, leaf and stem. A thick silence plopped down over the group as if someone had just thrown a rotten egg into an elevator. Herman Van Gandry, another of the Delta's veterans, was the first to laugh. And then they all laughed. The rest followed in quick succession. Kowalski tried to keep a straight face, but even he was rubbing his eyes before too long. Calvin, look. I know you mean well, and you know you've got a lot of respect from all of us, but come on. That's a fool's errand. Priscilla sneered down at him. When you can't come up with the money, men, and equipment to destabilize the world's most powerful, secretive, influential agency, you come let us know, and we'll make you king of shit mountain. How does that sound? Calvin raised both eyebrows this time and took a deep breath as he flipped further forward in the stack of papers in front of him. To this end, he continued, I'd like to cite the procedures established in the Summa Modus Operandi. Delta fell silent. A few of them looked towards each other, confused. Sylvester Sloan's eye suddenly became very sharp. Is that so? Hang on now, Dane Blank said, flipping hurriedly through his own papers. What's that? I haven't heard about that. That sounds important. Is it important? Desdemona Vance, the youngest member of the group, pulled a thick, filthy binder from a bag sitting beside her. Cracking it open, she leafed past the introduction to spot a few pages in and began reading. We hold the following to be inescapable truths. Calvin held up a hand. I'll save you the trouble. This document was written by the first Delta Command at the behest of the engineer himself. If we take this document at its word, then you don't need to destroy the Foundation to destroy the Foundation. You just need to destroy the Overseers. Priscilla barked out another laugh, one that was not shared by her fellows. Yes, of course, that will be so much easier. 13 immortal demigods that have no doubt long since buried themselves in spells and witchery. How simple. But Sylvester Sloan was still watching Calvin very closely. The 13th Overseer has assured immortality for the others so long as he sits on the council. You'd have to find him first, well. You'd have to find all of them at some point, which would be itself impossible unless you had... His eyes narrowed. Unless you had the journal. Calvin nodded, and reaching into a pocket beside the chest of his jacket, produced a small blue leather-bound book partially wrapped in brown paper. Holy shit! Where did you get that? Desdemona peered at it quizzically. What is it? Years ago, Kowalski said, we received a report that one of the Coalition's finest agents, some fellow with a weird code name, had been putting together a report about the Foundation overseas, where they live, places they frequent, their habits and activities. In other words, if you wanted to find the overseers, it would be the perfect place to start. I still don't understand, Priscilla said. Don't we keep tabs on the overseers? We know where they are, don't we? No. We tell our agents we do, and every now and again we'll get some report of one of them passing through and somebody getting a glimpse of them. If we really had to, we could probably come up with the real-time locations of maybe half, a few more if we got lucky. He extended a crooked finger towards the journal. But those overseers aren't why that's important. It's important because it supposedly contains the location of 2 overseers, including the 13th, who have never been seen before. Ever. Until that book was written, nobody was sure if they actually existed. Kowalski was furiously rubbing his temples. Okay, slow down. Let me think. He looked over the sheaf of papers in his hands again. Alright, so you say you can find them. That's great. That's a good start. But there's more to it than that. The contract. They've got a contract with death. And as long as they've got the contract, they can't die. That wasn't true when the Summa modus operandi was written, so that's why it's always been seems more of a guideline than a hard and fast protocol, because you can't kill death. Calvin nodded. You're right. You can't kill death. I don't think you'll have to kill death, though. You just need to break the contract. Sylvester leaned forward, responding now with carefully chosen words. If you ever wanted to break the contract, you need something that could steal someone back from death. You'd need... Well, you need something that hasn't existed in 100 years. Calvin fished back into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial of clear liquid. He set it on the table with a pronounced thunk. If you could break the contract, what then? Whispers surrounded Calvin. He was suddenly aware of the presence of something great and terrible. Something whose furious attention he had immediately gained. In the stillness of the warehouse behind Arcana and beneath the world above, the presence passed through and then it was gone. Then, as they had so many times before, Delta dissolved into chaos. Holy shit, Calvin, how did you... What is that? The fountain was dry, they emptied. Doesn't matter, even if he... It knows. We've said too much already. It would become possible to destroy the 13 Foundation Overseers. It would become possible to fulfill the Summa modus operandi. Kowalski had given up maintaining any kind of order to the stack of papers, and laid them out idly around him. Where in the world did you come up with that? Calvin returned the vial to his pocket. When we were moving against the Foundation storehouse in Bangladesh, when I was told I was misappropriating insurgency resources, he glared at Kowalski out of the corner of his eye. This is what we were looking for. It wasn't there, granted, but this... He held up the vial to eye level. I found this the same way I found that journal. Luck. Sylvester nodded slowly. If this is what we all here think it is, then I think you're right, Calvin. I think that would do it. He stroked the handful of wiry hairs on his shin. Do they know you have that? Calvin hesitated. No. Desdemona leaned forward. So what's your plan? Calvin slid the journal forward and set the vial next to it. We find every single one of those rotten bastards using this. He pushed a finger down on the journals, starting with the 13th and working forward. Once they're in the ground, the Foundation will be without governance and will fall apart. We sweep up the pieces, and with the overseers removed, this world can begin to heal. He leaned back. Someday down the line, we all wake up one day in a world no longer under the threat of the supernatural. A world free to choose its own destiny. Kowalski continued to flip through the papers Calvin had stacked in front of him, more slowly now. He paused on one passage and then looked up. All right, I'm convinced. Our resources are limited. If you wanted to attempt this like 20 years ago, we might have been in a better spot to help you. He drummed a finger on the table. Of course, you didn't have that journal before now, which is really the game changer here. Kowalski turned towards his colleagues. Any of you in opposition to this? If we do this, we have to do it. There's no half-assing it. I'll be the first to admit we are wildly outmatched, but if what Calvin says is true, we've at least got surprise on our side, which counts for something. He nodded. All in favor? They all spoke in unison. Aye. Kowalski turned back to Calvin. What do you need? Now. He had asked for 3 individuals, specialized in experienced agents each. The logic was straightforward enough. The Foundation was a massive, inexorable machine. Moving the means of the insurgency against it would fail, as it had time and time before. The insurgency had never quite recovered from being shattered by the Foundation all those years ago, and the squabbling factions and schisms within that group were only barely held together by Delta. Trying to turn that disorder into action would be disastrous. But a group of 4, a group small enough to sneak past the all-seeing eye of the Foundation, might make it work. The insurgency had resources, enough to create distractions where they were needed and reinforce the team if necessary, but Delta had made it very clear their reach had limits. If the group passed beyond Delta's ability to support them, they would be on their own. The first of them was Anthony Wright, a well-seasoned British agent of the insurgency in his 50s with a kill list nearly as long as his list of accolades. After Delta came into power, the insurgency had still only been little more than a handful of groups of beleaguered and chaotic idealists, but throughout their history, Anthony had been a voice of reason and direction. He had maintained the original goals of the insurgency and had been looked to for guidance for as long as anyone could remember. Whenever Delta had an opening, it was often thought he would take a seat at the table, but he had always refused the position. The second was a woman slightly younger than Calvin, but not much. Her name was Olivia Torres, and until a few years prior, she had been known within the anomalous community as the famed anarchist Ivory. Her installations were well known, especially in the 3 Portlands that she had called home. The Foundation, long believing that she was active within AWCY, or Are We Cool Yet circles, had pursued her relentlessly. When they finally closed in, she fled to the insurgency and had started fresh there. The last was Adam Ivanov, which caught Delta by surprise. Adam was young, inexperienced, and was not a fighter. He was good with computers, a prodigy even, but was next to useless with a gun. Calvin, however, was adamant in his decision. He knew about Adam before Adam had known about him, and had made a series of actions over the past several years that led Adam away from the Ukrainian separatist group that he had been involved with into the waiting arms of the insurgency. Calvin had history with Anthony and Olivia. He had trained with and fought alongside Anthony for the better part of the last decade, and Olivia had been assigned to him on a handful of raids before his exile. Both responded to his request eagerly. Adam, though, was hesitant. He had taken some convincing. Even still, Calvin could sense a desire in his heart. Adam had spent his youth as a Foundation D-class assigned to SCP-610 by virtue of his parents being Ukrainian political prisoners. A raid on a Foundation labor camp had liberated him from the horrors of his captivity, and Anthony had carried him out of the danger himself. When the young man heard that his savior was among those he would serve alongside, he quickly submitted to the request. Thus it was that a scant 3 months later, their small ship wrestled against the waves toward a jagged black spear that pierced the stormy waters of the southern Atlantic, looming with silent malevolence. Calvin stood on the ship's prow as the tower came into view. He could feel the mnestics burning in his mind. I guess I was supposed to say amnestics? He could see the shimmering glow of the tower's anomalous nature. A scar, he thought. What is it? He heard Olivia say as she took her place beside him. It's magic, right? A cognito hazard, maybe? No, not a cognito hazard. It's an anti-meme. The Foundation didn't build this. Something else did. A long time ago. Whatever they built it for isn't there anymore, so the Foundation has repurposed it. How do you escape a prison you don't even realize you're in? Or in our case, how do you find something that isn't on any map? That can't even be on a map. Olivia shrugged. I was wondering the same thing. How did you find where this was? Calvin produced a small blue journal. This was the personal journal of someone who had studied the overseers and their methods for decades. He flipped it over and back. It sat in a box for years before somebody realized what it was. When Skidder Marshall picked it up, he realized he'd struck gold. So how much did it cost? Nothing, I stole it. Olivia nodded and looked back towards the tower. It's beautiful in a way. Otherworldly. It is. A wave smashed against the side of the ship, surging up in front of them in a blanket of freezing sea foam. Calvin instinctively reached out to shield her. Olivia stepped back, but gave him a smile. The muted whine of the foghorn rose up behind them. Calvin turned and hurled himself up the stairs of the wheelhouse. There, Anthony Wright gruffly tugged at the wheel, in between taking long, hard puffs from this fat stogie that dangled out the side of his mouth. I'm not going to try to do a British accent right now. This is stupid, Calvin, Anthony said, furiously chomping on the cigar. There's nowhere to land. I haven't even been on a ship in 16 years. This was your plan? Calvin squinted at the tower. Their monastics would only last so long. Afterwards, they wouldn't even be able to perceive the tower. This had to be quick, and the seas were not helping. The entrance is above, Calvin pointed towards an opening in the rocky face. If you can get us up there? Anthony looked at him like he was mad. I'll get something up there. I hope you don't need the boat afterwards. Calvin slapped him on the back and grinned. There are always more boats. Anthony rolled his eyes and spun the wheel, bringing the ship around. The next swell, we're going to gun it. Tell them to hold on down there, because the only way we'll get this done is by wrecking the boat. You get that, right? This'll wreck the boat. Calvin nodded. All right, then. Let's wreck the boat. Calvin scurried down the stairs to find the others. Olivia and Adam were in the hallway. Adam looked ready to vomit. He grabbed them both and pulled them toward the galley, shoving them toward a pillar. Stay here and hold on! He turned to go back up, just as the ship slammed into a massive wave with the force of a thunderclap. The whole vessel lurched down, up, then forward. For one instant, Calvin could feel his guts squeezing up out of his throat, pressing against behind his clenched teeth. By the time he reached the top of the stairs, the ship's hull was screeching. Iron and wood grinded against harsh, merciless stone. The hull went on to make several undignified creaks and pops, then came to a stop. Calvin stumbled up to the deck. The boat was now fully docked inside the tower's entrance. Behind them, the ocean continued to rage. Adam was the first to crawl out behind Calvin, but only so he could heave the contents of his stomach over the rails. Anthony, who by some miracle remained mostly dry, walked down past Adam, unlatched the anchor, and threw it down over the side. It made a dull metallic thunk as it slammed into dry rock. Land ho! He announced. Adam wiped the spittle away from his mouth with the back of his sleeve. Madness! You're mad! This is madness! I can The whole place makes me dizzy. He tried to stand, stumbling backwards. You people, you old people, you're on your way out. I got my whole life ahead of me, and you crash us into the side of a mountain. Very considerate. He turned back to the railing and heaved again. Calvin patted Adam on the back. Patience, Adam. You'll stay here with Olivia and Anthony. I'll go alone. He looked back to Anthony. Make sure nobody follows me. Anthony nodded. Remember what I told you. Don't trust a word. They'll say anything. Lie through their teeth. Be careful. Calvin reassured the older man with a clap to the shoulder. I will. I'll need you, all of you, very soon. But this part, I can handle this alone. Calvin leapt over the railing and down to the stone below. The entryway narrowed into a tunnel. He followed the passage into the darkness ahead. It ended at a freight elevator after 40 meters. He could still hear the distant roar of the ocean echoing off the smooth stone walls. In the dim light, Calvin could barely make out deep cuts in the stone, almost like lacerations. He pulled the iron railing open, stepping inside and hitting a button. Just before it started down, it occurred to him that the entrance looked like it had been smashed into the tower rather than cut. He could not say how long the descent took. After a few minutes, the smooth metal of the shaft gave way to rock. The elevator's interior grew cold. He could make out the faint sound of something beating below. Calvin reached into his pocket and touched the vial, reassuring himself that it was still there. The elevator stopped. The carriage shuddered, and with a groan, the gate slid open. He had arrived at a massive chamber lit by torches, each burning with a smokeless emerald flame. The walls were carved with ancient runes that spiraled up into a yawning darkness. The same darkness yawned beneath his feet. Nothing stood between it and him, save the elevator and a steel-segmented walkway extending out from it. The walkway reached the center of the chamber. There, a column of stone rose up out of the pit. When Calvin took a step towards it, a pebble glanced off the side of his boot and fell below. He waited to hear it land. 2 minutes later, he stopped waiting. He crossed the chasm across the walkway. His footfalls were the only sound he heard, save one, the soft beating that came from below. As he drew close to the die, he could make out its solitary occupant. Seated on a small, plain metal folding chair, bound to it by thin gold chains, was a human corpse. Calvin opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by a sound. It was like a stale rattle, a horrid, empty noise. It filled the room like a chorus, echoing off the walls. It was laughter. Mocking laughter. He approached the corpse, examining it. Hollow, rotted sockets were all that remained of its eyes. Despite this, it stared at him with a fierce intensity. He felt that familiar chill again. Suddenly, the beating below stopped. A visitor. The corpse's mouth did not move. Nevertheless, a voice creaked out from it like a draft through a tomb. How peculiar. I don't often receive guests. Calvin hesitated. You're 0513, correct? In a sense. This body was once that of Dr. Felix Carter, the meddler. He was the 13th. I reside here in his place. Calvin nodded. So yes, then. Good. You will commune with me. I have come to renegotiate your contract. Something flashed across his vision. He saw endless fields of corpses, fire and blood. He saw a parade of red horrors, and a silent figure watching from above. Calvin shook his head and looked away. Then when he turned back, it almost looked like the corpse was smiling. You have no authority here, Calvin Lucian. Calvin stepped back in shock. Yes, I know your name. Yours is not one of the 13 penned on the contract. Your hand cannot break it. Calvin collected his nerve. You're right. It's not, but humor me if you would. Your contract, what are its terms? What were you promised? Somewhere inside the corpse something growled. Fine. No harm in humoring the soon-to-be dead. The contract offered an escape for the 13 from the hand of fate. Life everlasting. They already had the Fountain of Youth. Why do they need you? The fountain had run dry. Even then it could not save them from me, only keep me at arm's length. When they began to die, the first came to me to bargain. It offered to stay my hand in exchange for a seat at the table. It was a simple negotiation. Calvin walked behind the corpse. His eyes traced the sigils along the walls that surrounded them. And as part of the contract they gave you this man? Gave you his life? No. His life was insured as part of the contract. They gave me his body. He lingers on the edge of death eternally. His mind is given to the sublime ecstasy of near death. Calvin cocked his head sideways. He's not dead? No. Calvin pulled the vial from his pocket and pulled out the cork. Good. Drink up, you crusty old bitch. He reached out from behind the corpse, seizing it by the chin. With just a squeeze, he forced its mouth open. With the other hand, he emptied the contents of the vial into the pit of its throat, taking care to ensure not a drop was wasted. When the vial was empty, he released its face and stepped in front of it. What was that? Where did you get that? How did... The change was immediate. Color rushed back into the corpse's face, blood surged through its body. Fresh pink tissue filled the gaps where its skin had flaked away. Glistening knobs of white swelled up into its sockets. The emaciated torso spasmed, then expanded. The corpse lurched upwards and took in a gasping, choked breath. A violent, painful coughing spasm forced ages of collected dust to evacuate its lungs. Its arms lunged down to grab its chair. In the span of only a minute, the corpse had become a nude man. The convulsions began to settle. His eyes, hazel gold and now filled with fear, darted back and forth. What have you done? What have you done? Something dark and silver began to seep out of the man's eyes, nose, and mouth. It was like smoke, but thicker. It shimmered in the air above him like a cloud. His eyes rolled back towards the shape. He cried out like a panted animal, No! Don't leave me! Don't! Ow! Don't leave me! Don't! Calvin leveled his gun at the man and squeezed the trigger. He buried one slug in his temple, then another in his heart. Dr. Felix Carter jerked away with a final gasp. His body slumped into the chair. His head fell back. He stared into the darkness above. Calvin grabbed the back of the metal folding chair and dragged it to the edge of the die. With a firm shove of his boot, he pushed the chair along with its occupant into the pit below. There was a brief clatter of chains, then nothing. Calvin felt the presence again. When he turned, he found a silver woman draped in darkness standing alongside him. She peered into the darkness. Her eyes looked sad. The living body of the 13th, she said. The contract is invalid. I am released from my obligation. Calvin swallowed and nodded. Should fatal peril come to them, you will no longer stay your hand against the other 12? I will not. She did not look away from the pit. They are free to die. Calvin sighed. Good. That is enough. He turned back towards the elevator, taking a step. Something made him pause. He looked back to the pale figure, struggling with the question he wanted to ask. Why didn't you stop me? You have the authority and power to do so. Why did you stand by and do nothing? At last she turned and regarded him. Calvin felt an overwhelming swell of solitude, of melancholy rush through him. Something festers at the heart of the council. Something that will not die. I thought that perhaps, if I had a seat at their table, I could find it. Make it die. But I couldn't. There are things in this world beyond even my reach, Calvin Lucian. She turned back to the pit. Perhaps you will fare better. Perhaps not. Delta Command sent another ship to fetch them. Shortly after they boarded, Calvin was approached by Desdemona, who handed him a briefing. Did you have any trouble? Calvin shook his head. Getting here, getting in. He looked back towards where the tower had been. I can't even see it anymore, like it was never there, and yet he reached into his pocket, pulling out the journal. This guy knew about it a decade ago. The young woman laughed. Yes, well, I'm sure your mystery agent had his own way with things, just like we need you to have yours. All of our plans are in motion now, Calvin. They all rest on you performing your duty. She nodded in the direction of the absent tower. With any luck, the rest of them will be as simple as this. That's unlikely. We got a good first lick in while they weren't looking, but there won't be any surprise next time. Okay. Journal entry, the 13th Overseer. To the reader. A piece of it is X'd out, so I can't even read the first chunk. So I guess I'll just start with, in my travels, I've seen a great many horrors and wonders, and none are perhaps so great and terrible than those individuals who call themselves the overseers of the SCP Foundation. These individuals, who were once men and women themselves, have long since abandoned their humanity for the purpose of a pure-minded dedication to a single idea: the study and control of anomalous interactions in this universe. The amount of power they hold is staggering, and in many cases they can be more fearsome, I believe, than the entities they contain. To this end, I have dedicated my life to their study, tracking them and understanding them. This journal is the sum of my research, documenting the strange and unusual characteristics of these fearsome people. I cannot say what you may intend to use this information for, but I hope you find it helpful. All the best. What appears to be a letter L. The 13th Overseer. The story of the Overseer's rise to power begins with the individual known as the Other Overseer. Certain occult groups talk about him as if he is a sort of demon, and based on the information available to me, it is hard to deny their reasoning. Thanks for that, neighbor with the rap music. As the story is told, the Overseers once had access to the Fountain of Youth, a spring of water that would heal ailments and restore life, so long as you drank from it. Despite this, they found the limitations of this process stifling. They could drink and be young forever, but were still subject to death by any number of other means. The Overseers, determined to maintain their legacy perpetually, decided to conduct an occult ritual of their own, one that had been taught to them by the long-since diminished children of the Endless Waste. By bringing a person to the very brink of death and keeping them there, they would be able to summon death itself, who, no doubt, seeking to collect the soul, would appear to finish the job itself. It was decided that this would fall to the 13th Overseer, a man named Felix Carter, who, prior to his involvement in the Foundation, had been a physicist of some renown in certain circles. It is likely that Dr. Carter, of whom little record now exists, was among the first individuals contacted by the person who would later be called the Administrator, when the Foundation was in its infancy. By all accounts, the ritual was performed successfully, and the Avatar of Death appeared before the Council to bargain for the man's soul. Instead, the first Overseer proposed a deal: the life of Dr. Carter and his seat on the Council, in exchange for a stay of mortality for the other members. The extent of these negotiations is unknown, but it is believed that the Overseers were successful in convincing Death to agree to their terms. In order to preserve Dr. Carter's body and protect the structure of their contract, the Overseers had to find somewhere in the world to keep it where it could never be found by another person ever again. I cannot say for certain where Dr. Carter's body is today. However, it is known that there is a location in the South Atlantic in the cold and dangerous waters near the Central Islands, where sailors had periodically reported feeling a strange presence, something they could not identify and could not see, something that seemed to impair their very ability to perceive at all. This phenomenon I know well. The sailors, I believe, were suffering from exposure to a particularly potent anti-meme, something that humans are not able of perceiving. It is rumored in some circles that in days long past there existed a number of structures around the world that, possibly due to some calamity, were abandoned when their builders were suddenly and quietly snuffed out. These structures, it is said, would have been capable of sustaining similar powerful anti-memes. If this structure would exist, and I believe it very well may, it would only be possible for a human to perceive it if under the influence of a drug called a mnestic, a powerful psychoactive medicine that alters the way human brains process information. Unfortunately for all those who might be seeking out Dr. Carter's resting place, the entire supply of mnestics the world over is controlled by the very foundation who put him there. This, I believe, can be no coincidence. One last point of interest. There was a study conducted years ago by the Coalition to see if they could replicate the effects of mnestics using non-anomalous substances. Nearly all of the trials failed, but one showed promise. Dark rum, if exposed to sea air, has a very mild mnestic property. This study was cancelled and attempts to replicate the results were unsuccessful. Were it me, I might have considered combining the alcohol with laudanum, which has been known to exacerbate the effects of certain hallucinogens. However, it is perhaps for this reason that there are stories of sailors describing a towering black spire carved out of the pillars of Pandemonium itself, appearing to them briefly as their ships were thrashed by the uncaring seas. Or it could be nothing. To date, there are no records of any sightings of Dr. Carter since the day he was supposedly given up in exchange for life everlasting. If he still exists somewhere in the world, I would imagine an unknowable, imperceptible prison deep in the world's roughest seas would be the exact place he might be. Should one encounter the Overseer and the Avatar of Death, it should go without saying that extreme caution would be advised. No living man can say how far the grip of death extends. Interesting. So, having finished the 13th Overseer, we are at 37 minutes and some change. And I'll check to see how long this next one is. Let me boop. It's about as long as the other one, so we're not going to do that. It's looking like I'm just going to have to do one episode apiece for each Overseer. So Ouroboros is going to take for fucking ever. On the one hand, I'm sorry, but on the other hand, it's very interesting. On some third strange hand that I can only see out of the corner of my eye at midnight, I was intending on focusing on finishing Ouroboros before I did anything else on my channel, and I know there are people who are waiting for other things, and now that I know it's going to take 13 freaking episodes just to finish Ouroboros, minimum, I probably shouldn't do that. So, I don't know when the next episode is going to be, but also the other thing is I was going to not continue the 1300s until I was able to move on past Ouroboros, since one of the last 1300s entries I did is one of the next 001s I was going to cover after this, which again is taking for fucking ever. So, that being said, I'm going to stop here. Maybe the next one will be slightly quicker, but we'll find out when we get there. So, this has been Anashi Sasuke. If you liked it, I'd like to subscribe will be groovy. If you didn't, you need to do either one of those things. If you want to click the bell, you can do that as well, so you're notified of future uploads. Something percentage not subscribed that's watching. I don't have the thing pulled up. The reason my outro is what it is because although all the various YouTubers are like, oh, you should tell them to subscribe at the beginning of the video and blah, 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 blah. I can't make you hit the button if you don't want to. That's just how it is. So for the 80-something% of people who watch my channel that are not subscribed, if you want to, you can, and if you don't want to, I can't make you do it. So, have a good one, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Later.